Well, hello and welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. Today I bring you an interview with Dr. Claire Villarreal, an expert in Tibetan Buddhism and Tantra and all things meditative. And I guess we'll start there. So Claire is a fascinating, fantastic human being that I've been aware of for quite some time. You can check her out at clairevillarreal.com. And her, ClaireVillarreal.com. There is a ton of information on her website. You can check out meditation resources. She's got a blog. She's got a podcast called Letting Grow and a tab for Buddhism for Beginners, going over some basics and some reincarnation resources, which I just found and I can't wait to look up. So thanks, Claire, for having the conversation and for presenting this. This is a great resource for folks. She's also available on Insight Timer. She's doing a whole lot in the meditation world. And here is who she is. I'll read her bio real quick. Raised as a fundamentalist Christian in a small town in North Texas, who by the time she left for Rice University in 1995 knew that the religious tradition of her childhood did not suit her. When she stumbled across a course on East Asian civilizations co-taught by Anne Klein, she signed up with a deep curiosity of Asian religious culture. When Anne assigned Buddhist texts for the class reading, Claire was immediately hooked on the Dharma and added a religious studies major. When Claire started meditating with Ajahn Ken at Wat Buddhavas, definitely didn't get that right, and sitting with Anne Sangha at Dawn Mountain, she obsessed over Tibetan history and did a Tibetan studies semester abroad with the School for International Training. After graduation, Claire taught secondary English for a couple of years, trained in Wing Chun and Tai Chi at Authentic Kung Fu for 7 years, and left in 2003 for a long trip to Asia. After returning home, began formally teaching meditation. In 2007, Claire joined the doctoral program of Rice University's Department of Religion and spent the next 8 years learning, writing, and teaching about Tibetan Buddhism, contemplative ways of knowing, and how those can enrich modern Western life. After earning her PhD in 2015, she joined the staff of Dawn Mountain Center for Tibetan Buddhism, where she became the program's director before leaving in 2019 to offer meditation and spiritual instruction online and in person. Again, check her out at clairevillarreal.com. But also look below. I'm including a link to academia.edu for several of her papers, one in which I read that I found very entertaining that we talked about. So thank you, Claire. Wonderful stuff. Really enjoyed this. As far as housekeeping, the Sacred Speaks is brought to you by the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. It's a boutique integrative clinic that my wife, Leela Scott Price, and I started. Check us out at thecenterforhas.com. TheCenterforHAS.com. Tons of resources on that site, too, including a panel discussion between the clinicians at the center where we address topics that are coming into our office quite a bit, anxiety, depression, and the like. The music for the podcast, the theme music is from Modern Nations. Check them out at modernnationsmusic.com. Also, of course, check out the podcast website at thesacredspeaks.com, TheSacredspeaks.com, for the benefit of those listening. And also two upcoming episodes that I have already... I've already done the interviews, but I've got the editing to do, so I'll be doing that over the next few weeks. Dr. Mark Plotkin is coming up next. He's an ethnobotanist who's educated at Harvard and Yale. He was an apprentice under Richard Schultes, author of Plants of the Gods and famed ethnobotanist. And our conversation was fantastic. We talked about the Amazon, traditional shamanism of the northern Amazon, and plant medicine. His podcast is Plants of the Gods, which I highly recommend checking out. And then the next week, or the next maybe week or two after that, is an interview with Mark Ryan. He's a colleague that I work with at the on the curriculum committee at the Young Center down here in Houston. And he's a fantastic guide. His book is called A Different Dimension on Transpersonal Psychology, and my mind was quite expanded. So thank you both. I'm excited about those interviews. They'll be coming out soon. For now, I think that's it. We'll leave it there. So enjoy the interview, and lots going on here. So you'll be hearing more from me over the next 2 months. For now, we'll leave it there. Thanks for being here. What was your dissertation?
Um, so it's actually like I guess you could say an intellectual history of Tibetan philosophy and political history around emptiness. So like I kind of started with this guy who came up with this like heretical notion of emptiness called Shentong or other emptiness. He's Dolpopa, lived in the, late 13th to mid 14th century. I love him so much. But basically he like wrote about emptiness and Buddha nature in ways like nobody had written until then. So like he wrote about Buddha nature as being the Atman. He was like, no, there's an Atman. We have a truly established self. It's Buddha nature. Get over it. And I was like, what is this? This is amazing. And then the rest of my dissertation was like several hundred years of people trying to destroy his ideas, trying to destroy the sect of Buddhism that he kind of accidentally founded, and then like the revitalization of his ideas in the 1800s with this like great non-sectarian movement. So I got to just geek out on like all the history and all the philosophy, and it was awesome.
Well, so let's just dive in because you've actually
Sure.
you've written a dissertation on the subject that I wanted to start with.
Well, there we go.
So let's first. I want to I want to talk about how misunderstood and misused the term tantric is. I saw this episode of Portlandia once, and they were talking about like put a bird on it. It was like
Yeah.
put a bird on it, you know.
Yeah.
I think these days, if you just put tantric on it, you're something like, oh, hey, what does that mean? And
Yeah.
most people, I don't know. I have a learner's permit in this territory, um, but I want to talk about emptiness, and I want to talk about the difficulty in understanding emptiness from a Western kind of perspective and what that even means, right? Like,
Yeah.
because we have that juxtaposition. Jung had talked a lot, despite how influenced he was by Eastern and in particular Chinese Taoist philosophy. He was concerned about whether it be yoga or even Taoism, that the Westerner wasn't kind of steeped in that tradition. There was this kind of lineage connected more with the Mediterranean, which oddly enough is highly influenced by the East. But that Western, think Greek, Roman, so on and so forth. So, what in the hell was he getting at? What do you mean when you talk about emptiness? Why is it so difficult for Westerners? And is it difficult? How's that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good starting place.
Yeah.
Well, how many hours do we have?
We've got some time.
um
Whatever. We can go.
yeah, so the first thing I want to say is that emptiness is not just hard for Westerners to understand, it's hard for everyone to understand. And, part of the reason for that is that basically these ideas about emptiness, however you frame them, and people have framed emptiness in lots of different ways, but like all of these teachings point beyond what our ordinary mind can cognize, like from a
Mhm.
Buddhist perspective. And I think a lot of people want to find a different word for it, like they want it to be a translation error. Like it's this central concept, how can it really mean emptiness? But that is actually what it means. But what it means is not that everything is like empty, like that everything like is non-existent, or like this is a fake, like if I just thought hard enough I could like pass my hand through my computer. Like what it's saying, what emptiness means is that we're empty of something very specific. Like we're empty of inherent existence. So like
So,
obviously we all walk around, we have driver's license and addresses and social security numbers, but that's only really valid on the conventional level. Like when you start talking about ultimate truth, that's really where you get into the realm of emptiness, which is not really different from Buddha nature, which we can talk about in a minute.
yeah.
But in ultimate reality, there's nothing you can like posit and prove and like point your finger at, and have it stay still, have it not be moving and shifting even as you're pointing your finger at it. Does that make any sense?
Well, totally. I mean, it sounds to me like there's a perception issue. And so, how our human perception functions is we want to see concrete, somewhat concrete, definitive, identifiable aspects of reality. And from a perspective, if we blow that out, and really lift above the stratosphere and look down, that I would assume a term like illusory. It doesn't mean it's
Mm.
not there. It's just not as it appears to be.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can kind of break this down in like in terms of physics too. Like if you think about even our body, it seems like it's something easy to point a finger at, like this is my body, right? But if you think about it, like every minute we're breathing in and breathing out. And so there's a certain exchange of molecules between the outside world and the inside world. And so every single second there's like a very subtle change to what's even a component of my body. And then if you think about, well, where did each of those molecules come from? You start rewinding and you get to like, well, where did each carbon atom in my body come from? Well, it came from a dying star that died
Yeah.
and burst open in a supernova before our sun even formed. So like now what's my body and what's not my body? Like it just the whole question becomes problematized of like thinking there is a body to point to. And then if you do the same thing with your mind, that's like even that's even harder to find something to point to.
Well, so to me, there, and this is why I think Tantra is such an interesting. My learner's permit in Tantra has me at least knowing the concept of the left and right-handed traditions,
Yeah.
and I can start to get around that because what I hear you saying is that there is a concrete reality. I mean, I can't point to this body and I can hold and touch and feel it, but that to imagine that reality is only this is a limitation that's not exactly true. But there's something about human consciousness that has a need to connect with, understand, identify, and delineate concrete aspects of reality, but that we also have this kind of notion of a spiritual self, which is, I'm sure, a very Western idea. But the undefinable, non-dual, illusory aspects that are behind the veil of my perception. How am I tracking so far?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that is just a Western concept. Maybe the idea that there's like a definable self that once you get down to the spiritual level, you'll find a discrete thing and be able to point a finger at it and call that a self. You don't really find that idea in like the Buddhist tradition. But I mean, again, coming back to this notion of emptiness or this term, that's it's only after we've really dived into what we think is solid and teased it apart. We think we find something solid, we pull that thread. What happens if we keep pulling it? Sooner or later, the sweater falls apart. And it's only after the sweater has fallen apart and we're left with the space in sort of the aftermath of the unraveling of that sweater. That space is what you could call emptiness. That space is what you could call Buddha nature, like our true self that is not a self. Does that, does that
It
make any
does,
sense?
because if we're defining terms here, what I hear, I don't know, and this gets deep, into all the various like psychoanalysts and self, right, means a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But what I hear you saying is that there's a need for a socialized self, the sense of identity and a sense of orientation. But that's not quite true because it's not a whole understanding. And so it sounds like these practices are in some way intending to remember the nature of nature, right? And it's slippery as shit because that ego, I'll just call it an ego, right? That ego thing takes over, and it's like it contributes to this amazing amnesia that we have these fucking awesome experiences where it's like, oh my god, fucking God is within me, and this is amazing, and then I'm back to like pissed off because the fan won't work, and I
Right.
like, we. I don't know. I like what you were saying about Western, and maybe that's a thread that we can go down later, but like what that actually means and what that signifier is. But like you just told me you wrote a dissertation essentially on emptiness and political. Like, why? What was so interesting to you about that?
Yeah, well, this is something I love to talk about, so just stop me if I ramble on too long. But I think to give like the prologue to how I landed really on the topic of my dissertation, which is all about Dolpopa and the Jonang school of Tibetan Buddhism, which used to be a flourishing school, kind of got smushed in the 1650s when the last of the Tibetan civil wars happened. Um, what was distinctive about that school really was that they had a very different way of talking about emptiness and of talking about Buddha nature, which I'll get to in a second. But I think part of the reason that I was really drawn to it was that, I grew up Christian. I grew up in the Church of Christ, and I grew up with this idea of original sin. So the idea that like anything that comes from within me is already suspect because you're tainted from the get-go, right? So like there's this sense of like deficiency that I think was just kind of woven into, and I'm sure there's more to blame than just the Church of Christ for that, but like it was kind of woven into the way I saw myself and the way I saw the world. Like there's this division between like the created and the creator, and all the ultimate goodness lies with the creator. So like when I got into Buddhism, this idea of emptiness, the way it's traditionally presented is that like emptiness is the ultimate nature of everything. I mean, everybody would agree with that, like across the Buddhist spectrum. But the type of emptiness people are talking about often is the mere lack of inherent existence. So, like when I look through body and mind and I try and find something solid and substantial, and I spend years and meditate on it, and I finally come to this place where I'm like, holy cow, no, it's really not there. Like to present that as the final point of Buddhist inquiry, to me has a very different feeling tone from what I stumble across with Dolpopa's writings, and this sort of, it's called shentong, or emptiness of other. And the idea with that version of emptiness is that yes, you go through the entire process of like looking for an inherent self. Is myself my body? Is myself my mind? Are my memories me? Are my thoughts me? And each one of those, like in meditation, you tease it apart, and you end up in a space where you're like, nope, that's not it. So that would be what, from a shentong perspective would be called rangdong, self-emptiness. You look for a self, the thing you're looking at falls apart under examination. So self-emptiness. But what Dolpopa and these other shentong authors are saying is like beyond that, like that's when it opens up and you realize other emptiness, which is the true Buddha nature, empty of all that is other than itself.
Oh,
So
you got
it's
to say
still a
that
form
again.
of emptiness.
Empty of all that is. Say it again.
It's your Buddha nature, empty of all that is other than itself.
Uh huh. Okay. Yeah,
So
I
like
track
if you
that.
think about rangdong or self emptiness, you look for something that was there, you pulled it apart, you find the emptiness of self. But that opens up, again, through deep meditative practice, that opens up into an experience of true, your true nature, which is Buddha nature, which is empty of everything other than itself, which is the whole
Mm.
goal of spiritual practice, is to purify everything that is not our Buddha nature and to arrive in that place.
Of like, to me, it sounds like a perpetual acid trip. Like we're talking. It's like, does this shit stay forever? Shit, I don't. I don't
Yeah.
know how to. I don't know how to put on my clothes. Uh, like, what about that piece? Because from the kind of the traditional Jungian space, we would talk about like, well, I need an ego, right? I need to be able to like
Yeah.
set my alarm and orient myself and know that I'm driving between the lanes in traffic. And like
Right.
if I've experienced moments like that briefly. Whoa, that's like radical. And I think I think about. I was actually just having a conversation recently with somebody who we had talked about, what a bad trip is, and somebody mentioned like, well, usually a bad trip happens when somebody's like, is this going to last forever? It's
Mm,
the ego's sense of like, I need to get oriented, I need to be here, I need to find a
mhm.
way to like get into the tangible reality, and oh shit, am I like not able to do that ever again, and now I'm
Yeah.
in a state of terror. Do you think about that, like the ways in which the psychedelic community currently and the meditation communities are kind of saying similar things?
Yeah, I think there's actually a Tibetan term, a Tibetan idea that I think is really helpful here, which is nyam, which means like a meditative experience.
Like a peak experience.
So, yeah, and a nyam is what you're kind of talking about here. Like when you have this cracking open experience, whether it happens in like a, long retreat or through a psychedelic journey or whatever way, sometimes people have spontaneous openings like that.
Sure.
And for a moment, it's like you've taken off your
Yeah.
ordinary sense of reality and you've left it somewhere. And, it is a profound experience. Um, in the Tibetan tradition, that's distinguished from realization, which is something
Mm-hmm.
ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
So these nyam, one way of thinking about them is that their function is to kind of show us what's out there, to crack
Amen.
something open for us
Yep.
and to help us realize like, oh my God, reality is not anything like what I've been constructing it to be.
Not at all.
No, but and this is I think is, when it comes to like functioning in the world, this is I think where people sometimes, think about, oh my God, an ongoing state of that, like how could you even function? That it's not the point to try and like navigate the world in, the equivalent of like a permanent acid trip. Like the idea is those of us who are like not fully awakened yet can really only see the world either in a conventional way or in an ultimate way. But a Buddha, somebody who's like fully realized that ultimate state, actually has both, like at
Have
the
you
same
met
time.
anybody that is in that space?
I mean, I've met some amazing beings, but the thing is, you wouldn't necessarily know, like according to the tradition. I mean, like my cat could be a Buddha
Right.
manifesting as a cat to be like, look, dude, you need to learn how to love difficult people. All right, I'm going to claw you again.
I like that movie Soul because it, the dude that was like throwing the sign all over the place and like dancing was the guy who was
Yes,
like totally enlightened.
yes. Yeah. What was it? Mystics Without Borders?
Yes.
Yeah. I love it.
Yes. What? But even that, like, I think that attitude certainly broadens one's experience if you're looking at your cat as your like teacher, like, or I heard that. I heard Satan. The term Satan was connected to Hebrew, Satan, and what it meant was object thrown across one's path.
Mm,
Like and I think that's Elaine Pagels, so it comes from a notable source. But to me, when you have that attitude, which doesn't say like Satan is down there and I'm going to
mm,
locate him geographically and say it's evil, versus that like I can conceptualize any obstruction as something that is teaching me. I mean, wouldn't I get the world would be pretty radical if that were our attitude.
yeah.
Your cat maybe needs to go on tour and teach.
I should set up an Instagram account.
Oh, absolutely, for your cat, yes.
Yeah, obviously.
What would you
I
call
don't
it?
I don't have a cat, just for the record, but I'm just using this
Just
as
so
an
everybody
as an
knows.
empty cat.
Yeah, what would your cat's name be if you did have a cat?
I had a cat. Her name was Assisi. I think she may have been a Buddha manifesting to help me get through grad school by purring.
Well, good, I'm happy you had that teacher. So okay, um, we're kind of tracking down this idea of emptiness, and I think it's necessary for you put the brakes on if we need to. If there's more here, I'm sure there is. But the other idea or concept to me, for some reason, why these are associated is something that's hard to grasp from a kind of typical Western perspective is attachment.
Mm,
Can
yeah.
you connect these or?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around this idea of attachment and the way the term gets used, in Western context, like, psychology and
Yeah,
psychotherapy where you have healthy
developmental
attachment.
psychology, sure.
Yeah, exactly. Versus, maybe some of the original terms in Asian languages that get translated as attachment. Um, so for instance, the basic problem, and I'm going to say with like clinging rather than attachment,
Mm-hmm.
because the word attachment I think can have a lot of different positive meanings, but one meaning I think that kind of comes through with the idea of clinging is like a stuckness. Like with attachment, you can be attached to somebody and let them be themselves and flower and grow, but with that sense of clinging or grabbing onto, what you really want is something static. And again, coming back to the idea of emptiness, if each of us is constantly changing and evolving, and what I think of as myself is going to be different in 5 seconds and it's going to be different in a year and different in 20 years, then the idea of something external to myself that is going to make me happy is like super problematic, because it might bring me joy right now, but what happens in the next moment? What happens when the thing I bought that I loved so much, when it breaks? If my happiness depends on it being in a certain condition, I'm inevitably going to become unhappy when it changes, when it breaks, when I lose it, when it no longer pleases me, when I change. So, I think we tend to locate our happiness in objects or in circumstances. And what the Buddhist tradition is saying is, well, that's the problem. Happiness, true lasting contentment and joy and peace, that kind of thing comes like from letting go, but not because we're like, I'm not attached to anything anymore, I've overcome that. It's when we understand, like, no, I already have everything I need. Like, there's already a Buddha within me. Can I nourish that instead of going, I don't know, for extra followers on Instagram, or like whatever it is that we think is going to make us happy? So it's that clinging, it's that stuckness that in a certain sense prevents us from like fully unfolding our wings, because we're trying to really nail this identity that is too small, that's never going to fit, that's not going to keep up with our constantly changing actual, circumstances, and that doesn't refer to who we really are. It refers to you know, to the mask, in sort of like a Greek tragedy kind of sense, to the mask that we're trying to perfect for the world. Like if
Mm-hmm.
that's where our energy goes, we're never going to turn it inside and discover the true source of happiness. Is that at all addressing your question?
Yeah, and I was thinking about how often I liked your kind of theatrical play on the inflation that happens around letting go when it I think my thought was that there's this binary either or kind of thing. Like if I've let go and I'm not attached, then socially I am defensive, guarded, protected, not. I have to be either one or the other. And I think what you're saying is really valuable, because if I'm not attached to this identity and I also have love and appreciation and connection and a desire to see other people's true nature too, that's a problem. That's a very healthy worldview. But but I okay. So yes, I think you got it. But as you were talking, also I realized that I wanted to pick back up the thread of your early Christian experience.
Yeah. Before we go there, if you don't mind, I want to just come back to your sense of like, if you're not attached, you're like a little bit standoffish.
Yeah.
I kind of think of that as like performative non-attachment,
Ooh, I
like
like that.
trying to act out a role of like, I don't need other people, I don't need whatever. You never get to true non-attachment through trying not to be attached. You only get there by understanding the actual nature of yourself and everyone around you. It's not possible to think I am real and you are real and not be attached in some way, or performing non-attachment. like the only way is through really cutting the roots of these like mistaken assumptions that we have about the world. So I just wanted to like, I wanted to throw that out there because I think what you mentioned is actually really important, that people have a vision of what non-attachment looks like. I
Mhm.
mean, I tried to do it in my 20s. I was
Sure.
like, I'm gonna be so zen. I'm gonna have like as few possessions as possible. And it doesn't lead to the Dharma. It leads to like, looking like the Dharma.
Very regal when you kind of get out there. Yeah,
Uh,
no, I think that's an important. I'm glad you came back to it because there, I don't know, it's so prescriptive. Like
yeah.
there's so much out there that's prescriptive, and whether it's psychedelics or meditation practice or making love or giving to others, opening. I love that comment about enlightenment's an accident, but meditation or spiritual practice makes you accident prone. And so
That's great.
having
Yeah.
those kinds of practices to see beyond, and this starts to get into some of our conversation later on that we're going to have about shamanism, but to see beyond the kind of socialized identity
Mhm.
and my projections and judgments about your socialized identity and how I'm experiencing you, um, to get above, beyond, or through that, I think is probably one of the most worthy and important tasks of our lives as human beings.
Yeah.
But
Definitely
not,
in this moment of racial reckoning and
oh,
stuff like that, kind of trying to skip over it, go around it, push it out of awareness doesn't really work.
right. Well, okay, so can we jump back to you as an early Christian?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, what was Buddhism, or what was your initiation into Buddhism?
Yeah. So in the Church of Christ in the small town where I grew up, like the idea was nobody but people in the Church of Christ was going to heaven. Everyone else was going to hell. So I think, I had this curiosity about other traditions. Like I remember this one day in Sunday school when we were supposed to like learn about other religions and I was like, "Yeah, finally, here we go." And then it turned out we were going to learn about like Methodists and how to convert them to being Church of Christ and like Baptists and how to convert, and I was like, "I don't think this is going to
Oh,
work."
wow, wow.
Yeah, so I went from that like, childhood of being, pretty into the whole God idea. And then as I got older and I kind of understood a bit more about like the tradition as it had developed, I was like, this is not intellectually tenable for me. So, like, by the time I headed off to Rice, big city of Houston, all these new experiences, I was agnostic and I was searching, but I didn't know what I was searching for. Like, I thought it was maybe philosophy or,
Mhm.
like religion. I just thought of religion as Christianity. And I was not interested at all. But then like I had always been interested in Asia and Asian cultures, and I think at this point in my life there's just a strong karmic connection between me and like Asian Buddhism. And so I signed up for this like East Asian cultures survey course, and Anne Klein happened to be one of the three professors, and she assigned us this text basically on emptiness. And as soon as I read it, I was like, I've been thinking about this my whole life. Like somebody made a religion about this. This is
Yeah. They got a
awesome.
fucking name for this thing. This is amazing.
Exactly. Like for thousands of years, people have been like geeking out and nerding out about this stuff too. And like now I get to
Yeah.
read that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was love at first sight slash an immediate karmic connection. I added a religious studies major. I jumped right in. Like, I went to Thailand to practice meditation intensively after I graduated. Like I just did everything I could to really understand like in the traditional context what this tradition was about.
Hmm. That was, so you were doing your bachelor's then.
Yeah, it was a million years ago. It was like 97
Whoa.
probably.
Yeah, you did and did you jump straight into doctorate?
Oh, heck no. I got out and I was like, I'm never going back to school again. I spent 8 years, teaching and traveling in Asia, teaching like secondary English in a classroom and traveling to Asia and basically just trying to figure out like if if all I want to do is study the Dharma and maybe teach it one day, like what does that look like? And eventually I ended up back in grad school because I just had, questions that would need research to answer them. And in that 8-year period, I had done the teaching thing. I had also kind of started to teach meditation because I was living in Fort Worth. There was just like hardly any meditation instruction on offer there in English. And I had friends who were like, "We want to learn." And I was like, "I guess I am a certified teacher." And I have been meditating for a while. And my meditation teachers gave me the thumbs up. So yeah, that's what I had been doing before I kind of came back to grad school at Rice.
So your travels, what were t- how did you find teachers? How did you like spiritual teachers? How did they show up in your life?
Well, in an East Asian culture survey course, yeah, Anne really, I would say, she's the one who catalyzed my whole interest in Buddhism, and she and her husband Harvey at Dawn Mountain, I would say kind of became some of my first teachers. I was very wary of practicing Tibetan Buddhism in the beginning just because of my not great breakup with Christianity. Like it has all the outward forms of religion. I was like, not interested. So there was someone I added my religious studies major, and so the next semester after I took Anne's class, I was in a class with Bill Parsons, and he brought in Ajahn Ken from Wat Budawas in sort of the northwest corner of Houston, this Thai temple. And Ajahn Ken, again, it was I think just kind of a karmic connection. Like he came in, he looked so serious. He's a Thai monastic, so he had like the saffron robes and like very straight face. He's like telling us about monastic life. I was like, oh, that's kind of scary. And then during the Q&A session at the end, like some other student like puts up their hand and asks, like, you've been kind of sticking your hand into your robes and looking at this thing like during this time. What are you looking at? And he pulled out a watch and he goes, my watch, and smiled. And I was like, sold. I'm sold. I want to
Yeah.
I want to do what you're doing. So I started going out to Wat Budawas. I started, practicing meditation. I was very into Gandhi, who like made a lot of vows. So I was like, I'm gonna make a vow that I'm gonna sit in meditation every day. And so I just kind of, I jumped in with them. And, you know, I have had other teachers, like mostly I've gotten connected with other Tibetan teachers through Anne and Harvey. And I'm very drawn to like Ajahn Chah, one of the great
Mm-hmm.
masters of the Thai forest tradition in the last generation. I'm very cautious about really forming a strong relationship with people as teachers because it's a very intimate relationship, and I want to really know someone before I, you know, proceed to that kind of depth. Um, but I feel like I've really lucked out, especially with Anne and Harvey, like meeting trustworthy teachers and people who can explain in a Western cultural context, the importance of the Dharma.
Well, you've just commented on two of the podcast participants, Bill Parsons and Harvey. Both have been on the podcast, so check out those episodes. Anne, I'm still stalking, so she's gonna
One of these days, hopefully.
one of these days. She said she'd do it, but we were sitting together one day, and I said I'm gonna knock on your freaking door. No, yeah, good community, and Dawn Mountain is down here in Houston. It's a wonderful meditation space for the community. Anybody can go in there anytime, and I like the work they do a lot. Did you meet any folks on your travels? Did you ever stumble into the kind of mystical arenas?
Um, I've had a lot of really wonderful opportunities and experiences on my travels. I would say, I mean, I feel a strong connection with Pulahari Monastery in sort of the foothills of the Himalayas right outside of Kathmandu. They have a really wonderful philosophy program that I did. I haven't really kept in touch with, the teachers from there. I actually have a couple of friends and colleagues who are translators for that program, but I guess a lot of the sort of transcendent moments that I had abroad and here at home too really have come more through retreat.
Mm.
So, I don't have like these amazing stories of sort of like meeting a teacher and just like
Mhm.
immediately having an ecstatic experience. I will say though, the first time that I went to Wat Pa Nanachat in sort of northeastern Thailand, where I traveled there with my teacher Ajahn Ken and some people from his monastery, and when I kind of came back up there to stay and do practice at Wat Pa, I had this amazing experience where for probably like 36 or 48 hours, my mind was just naturally clear, just all the time, like no thoughts. I've never had that experience before, even in like deep meditation. And it was a beautiful like introduction to that place and to the blessings, I think, of like the Thai forest tradition. They don't talk a lot about blessings in that tradition. Tibetans talk about them a lot, but I really felt the power of the place to support my practice. So it's not like a teacher meeting story so much as like a place meeting story, but it was very powerful.
Well, it could be a tree or a cat, I guess. That's the
Yeah, exactly.
what in your spiritual practice, what kind of conflicts did you notice considering your Christian upbringing, and how did you navigate those?
Yeah, I think for me, um, the big one that I think I'm still working with, well, I mean, obviously there's this idea of original sin. And I don't want to blame like my entire sense of like deficient emptiness or like a, sort of a deficiency at the core of my being. I don't want to blame it all on that. But I think there's something powerful to, in those formative years being kind of told like you really can't trust anything that comes from within yourself. It's all sinful. So there's that. And I feel like the emphasis on Buddha nature is a really powerful like counterbalance to that. But the other thing I would say really is, just a resistance to feeling that there is one truth and I have it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's turned me into a very specific type of Buddhist, like more of a Buddhist pluralist. And a lot of people seem to have this natural like faith and devotion. And I feel like I come much more from a place of skepticism personally.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, all of that is probably still the heritage of having really invested in one tradition as a small child and then having the experience of waking up out of it and realizing, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I think some folks have maybe been distorting some things this whole time. Um, so yeah, I think to be able to like appreciate and get into the more devotional or the more heartfelt side of Tibetan Buddhism in particular, it's been a long trust building process. And so I guess that's more like the content. I think in terms of the process of the spiritual life, I very much came into like Buddhist practice with this kind of like fundamentalist Christian attitude
Yeah.
of like, I'm going to do everything. If I'm not doing, like a maximum amount of stuff, I'm not doing everything I could be. A lot of judgment toward myself and others, like I'm failing as a Buddhist, the sort of stuff you think you're leaving behind when as a Westerner you come to like an Asian tradition. But I found it's been a really long process of like, starting out my spiritual journey very rigid, sitting down. I'm going to have pristine mindfulness all the time when I'm sitting to like now I'm just much more like relaxed.
God, it
um,
just feels better.
oh my
I
God.
feel
Yeah.
better when you say it like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not sustainable to be that tight with your
Right.
practice for me.
I'm just sitting with the spiritual practice and your I can't imagine what you started seeing when you look at all these traditionally Tibetan spaces, and I mean it's interesting. It's a different like religious aesthetic space,
Yeah.
and for a
Yeah.
Christian, it can be pretty overwhelming.
Again, I have to come back to karma on this one because like the Church of Christ, I mean, they're so like iconoclastic. They don't even have, crucifixes. Like they don't want anything other than just like a simple cross because it's too idolatrous. So it's like extremely stripped down religious symbolism. And for me, the whole Tibetan thing was like, oh, I love the aesthetic of this. Like, I was not concerned with like wrathful deities, drinking blood out of a skull cup and stuff. I was like, this is really cool. Just, I don't want to have to like bow down to a lama,
Yes.
like my hangups were very probably not typical. I think a lot of people do get freaked out by the whole, the aesthetic and the iconography, but I loved it. It felt like sacred space.
Yeah.
It's just I wasn't sure I trusted, the model of spiritual practice that was on offer. That's very devotional toward the Lama, the guru, and you know, that's the part of it that, having come in from an academic study of Tibetan Buddhism, I was like, yeah, but you also see how these guys were putting themselves at the pinnacle of society, and here's all the advantages they got from, their position. And how do you tease apart power and economics from, spiritual authority? So it really took me experiencing what a really, good-hearted, compassionately motivated lama or teacher is about, for me to be like, oh, okay, now I get it.
So is that what you were getting at earlier when you were talking about the political aspects of you were talking about status, power in these Tibetan practices, and your analysis in your dissertation was looking at least partially looking at that?
Well, the historical narrative that I tracked in my dissertation, it does have to do with sort of the political and the economic power that, how do I say it? Like having the dominant philosophy of the time, like what comes with that? And so what I was tracking really was Dolpopa in sort of the early 1300s, starting this new school, what became a new school of Tibetan Buddhism. And the way, people, the way things worked in old Tibet was you had monasteries, you had different sects, and really each monastery was kind of supported by local rulers. So there ended up being these alliances between Buddhist sects and local rulers. And in my dissertation, really where that all comes to a head is in the mid 1600s, when there's kind of a civil war in Tibet between two different political factions backed by two different religious factions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's during that time that the folks who ended up winning, the Gelugpa school, who the Dalai Lama is the sort of the head of, not exactly the head, but he's the most recognizable figure of it. When the fifth Dalai Lama came to power in the mid 1600s, they actively tried to suppress and crush um, the backing that the Jonang, leaders that I had written about, the backing that they had, and also their philosophical texts. So that I just found this, intertwining of philosophical dominance and political dominance in ways that I found very interesting. And I think it's always something problematic always seems to come from this concatenation of political and religious power. um
It doesn't
yeah,
seem very Buddhist.
I mean, no. Like people were like fighting each other over emptiness, which is absurd. And
What?
yet people are still people.
Right. Yeah. Say more about that. People are fighting people over infinite emptiness.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but like the school the school that ended up winning this civil war, the Gelugpa school, their take on emptiness is very much what my authors would call rangtong, that self-emptiness. You analyze your sense of self, you find nothing, and you have to stay right there in that not finding. And it is a sacred space. So that was their view of emptiness. And it was developed partly as a backlash against my guy Dolpopa, writing that there's this other emptiness, that Buddha nature is truly established, that it's empty of everything other than itself. So they really disliked that idea. So when they took over at least central Tibet in the mid 1600s, they ordered all of Dolpopo's writings to be locked up. So nobody was allowed to print them, nobody was allowed to study them. And, because of that flow of political power, there was also a suppression of that idea in central Tibet for a couple of hundred years before people were able to actually, unearth those texts again and start practicing and printing and teaching them.
It's like the Eastern definition of enantiodromia, like the emptiness, non-attachment, and if you don't believe what I believe, I'll fucking kill you.
Right, yeah.
Like it's baffling to me because you think about that in Christianity all the time, where it's like forgiveness and love and acceptance and all that thing. And if you don't believe what I believe, I'll war you, or we'll create a denomination. Or so it is. I mean, of course, right? Of course, this happens. Jeff
Yeah.
Kripal and I had a great conversation on, the need for a secular political landscape. And certainly what's happened in the West, is that religions have proliferated, but it does prevent, hopefully, not always, the religious, the tie between the religion and the political factions. But yeah, I hear it that you're exaggerating, but it doesn't sound like you're exaggerating. I mean, there's a battle and a civil war, and like, are when you were reading all this stuff, are they even slightly conscious of the conflict, like in themselves? Like,
I should just say, like, I've been fascinated by Tibetan history since I was an undergrad. So, like, the very first paper I wrote was about Tibetan history, basically, for like my final paper in my course with Anne. So, like, none of this was a surprise to me. And I should just say also, it's not that the Gelugpas squashed the Jonang school because of their beliefs on emptiness explicitly. It was more that both sides had the backing of powerful Mongols. So, like, whoever took over Tibet, unless they just wanted to keep fighting different sects of Mongols, was gonna have to, suppress in some way their political adversary.
one ring of power to rule them all. That's the
Yeah, exactly.
tale
And
as old as
especially if the
time.
rings are Mongols, you don't want that coming back again and again.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened was, and this is the part that I find really interesting, and I don't want to posit a causal connection because I'm not sure there is one, but like there's the Gelugpas on one side with one definition of emptiness, this more reductive, Rangtong self-emptiness. And then on the other side of this civil war was the Kagyu school, which by that point had a version of Shandong, and then the Jonang school, which was the originator of Shandong. So it was like a Rangtong versus Shandong civil war, but
That's
it
fun to
wasn't
say.
about. Pardon.
That's fun to say.
Yeah. It's kind of heartbreaking to hear, but it wasn't about like the philosophy per se. It was who had the support of what Mongols and who had like these long-standing, clashes with each other. But at the end of the day, the outcome was still that, intellectually, this Shentong version of Buddha nature was suppressed for a couple hundred years.
Oh my gosh! I mean, what a wild concept.
Yeah.
So,
And no, there's not a lot of like recognition of like, hey y'all, isn't it crazy that we're trying to kill each other over the dharma?
right.
You know, yeah, the irony bells did not go off there.
Well, it's almost like their kind of religious spiritual nature wasn't leading the charge. I mean, it was about a social, political, tribal, like geographical power, and maybe Maslow is right. Like when your home's getting
Yeah.
shit on, you're gonna fight, and who gives a shit what you think about emptiness when like it is kind of a function of priority at that point. And so I don't mean to reduce it to say how dare they not be aware of the conflict, because I don't know what I would do if somebody's trying to burn down my house. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, and it was the political rulers who got into it, and they kind of ended up dragging along, these different
wow.
monasteries kind of within their territories, and the monasteries were getting sacked and destroyed. So, with that kind of trauma, it is hard to hold the larger
Yes.
view of things. But that's, part of to just like finish sort of this narrative arc of the political conflict in the 1800s in Tibet, in Eastern Tibet. You have really like the opposite of that civil war. You have these great teachers consciously making an effort to make connections across traditions, to receive the lineages of multiple traditions, to hold them. There's a really conscious effort in the opposite direction. And that's when you see Shentong, this emphasis on Buddha nature, that's when you see it coming back again. So, there's like a dark moment, but there's also a real dawning of something different. And it's partly because of those efforts in the 18 and 1900s that when China invaded Tibet in the 1950s, many of these smaller lineages, their texts had been written down. There were more people to transmit those lineages. Like a lot more would have been lost in the 1900s if not for this movement in the 1800s. So there was an awareness of the history and a willingness, really this time, of the spiritual leaders. They were the ones out in front driving this. And it really ushered in a time, a kind of golden age of practice and writings and transmission of the dharma.
But there's inherently a pluralistic cohesion that's created. It is not an either or
Right.
conflict. So it's certainly a feather in the cap for pluralism. Where
Yeah. Yeah,
that's
it's actually, it's called the Rime movement, the non-sectarian movement.
huh.
So there's a specific, anti-sectarian bent in the moment to it.
Oh my God, yes. When you've had your you know genealogy totally disrupted in civil war, like you're highly motivated. I
Right,
hope.
right.
Well, good. That does seem like it's a good kind of close out of the historical piece. Um, I want to the two threads that your paper here, and with your permission, I'll include a link to
Sure,
this
sure.
on academia. The I love your title of this paper, Shamalama Buddha: Occult Techniques and the Popularization of Tantric Ritual in Tibet.
Yeah, I mean, I should probably publish that as like a book because I think just
Totally.
Tantra, Tibet, like it has all the buzzwords people
Oh,
are looking
totally.
for.
Yes. Yeah, you've got a bird on it. You've got a tantric bird
Oh
on it.
yeah,
You're
put a
good.
tantric bird in that.
Uh, so the important piece for, I think, where this podcast has been mining. I mean, there's a lot of interest in psychedelics and shamanism and what that even is, mysticism. I have not really explored the tantric landscape. So would you kind of set us up a little bit? Either route here, or I would actually maybe be more directive. I would like you to start with some tantric definition of terms. What is that? What does it mean? What people tend to get wrong, and how they, see some bendy person having sex for 14 hours as defined by as but like, so that thing, let's tend to that. But I really liked this thread in your paper about the not only the definition of shamanism from a kind of Tibetan lineage, and it's very similar to the definition that my last participant gave me about shamanism when working with altered states of consciousness. So yeah, lob ball, take that, and let's talk tantra.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I should also just say I wrote that paper quite a while ago, and it didn't occur to me to reread it before we're talking. So there's no telling if what I'm about to say matches with it.
I'm so excited. I know your paper better than you do. Yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of a fresh moment to explore.
I'm going to quote you back to yourself and we'll see what you think.
Oh man, that sounds so awkward. Um, yeah, so the basic definition of Tantra, I mean, these two big categories of Tantra and shamanism, like both of them are actually really kind of difficult to explain
Yeah.
or to define. Um, but for Tantra, I'll just speak about Buddhist Tantra because there are different forms. And I know some people, I think maybe even Jeff kind of used Tantra as like a comparative category to look
Mm-hmm.
at similar practices that people are doing in sometimes pretty different traditions and have a way of thinking through that. But in a Buddhist context, like from a Tibetan Buddhist context anyway, like, so I come from the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. And in that school, we have basically three categories of teachings. So there's sutra, which is, you know, teachings about, like, all three of these at the end of the day are about the same thing. You know, they're all about emptiness, they're all about Buddha nature, they're all about impermanence, they're all about lack of an inherently existent self, but they come at it from very different angles.
Mm-hmm.
So the sutra angle is, you know, you memorize the definition of emptiness, you memorize the definition of impermanence. You know, it's all about, I would say, kind of the intellectual understanding of the basics. And you're learning how to sit and meditate and just have your mind not go everywhere all at once. So you're really kind of developing the tools and the skills that you need to investigate reality more deeply. The sutra level, the sutras, each of these are a different category of text. So the sutras are what we might think of as like traditional Buddhist teachings, you know, what the Buddha taught, later texts from the Mahayana tradition that developed over, you know, about the 1500 year, or more than that, almost probably a couple of thousand years after the time of Buddha, these different texts that kind of developed in India. So you have, you know, texts in the sutra tradition on emptiness, on compassion, on, you know, all sorts of different topics. All of it kind of coming at it from what we might call like a more conventional or like ordinary perspective, where you're learning facts, you're learning how to work with your mind.
Yeah.
This is like a total, hopefully it's not too much of an oversimplification, but like each of these categories we could unpack it, you know, in a lot more detail. If you look at Tantra, again, in a Buddhist perspective, you're still working with emptiness, you're still working with compassion, but you're doing it in a very different way. So the idea behind Tantra, and there are many, you know, tantric texts, um, there's a whole system for sort of introducing people to these teachings through what are called wangs, or empowerments, you know, a big ritual where everybody is in a room and they receive almost like an introduction to the energy of this Buddha. So whether it's a Buddha of compassion or a Buddha of wisdom, whatever, you know, the teacher is kind of holding that energy, and then everyone in the room is, it's like you're all tuning forks, you know, and the one big tuning fork has been struck, and the idea is everyone in that room receiving that transmission kind of learns how to vibrate at that frequency. So that's like your entry into tantric practice. There's no sex involved. Like, I think there are some secret tantric something sexual things in the Buddhist tradition still. I've never run across them at all. Like, I think they're very rare. They're very advanced. If you're going to do Buddhist tantra and you haven't been like at it in a secret community for years already, I would definitely not trust anyone who's like, "Hey man, I have some Buddhist tantra here. You want it?"
Well, because that is a term that you used quite a lot, which is esoteric,
Yeah.
and even I understand this in probably too rationalistic, but the sutra part of, to understand a language system and be able to comprehend and identify and recognize, and you know, why do we do this ritual, and where do I stand, and how do I do this, and when do I excuse me, bow, and you know, that places me in a kind of mythic worldview, and that would be, I think, an important precursor to being able to get into some of this deeper stuff. But by its very nature, you know, I have to go through it experientially and intellectually in order to even to enter into the hidden room that's behind the hidden room, to be able to do the crazy sex practices.
Yeah, yeah. And the crazy sex practices, I mean, my understanding of them is they're about the movement of energy in your body.
Yeah.
And you can do that through a variety of means. So
Right.
most of it you're imagining, you know, moving energy through the body, and by imagining the movement it happens, right?
Right.
So it's not like the real tantra is the sex tantra that happens in a back room somewhere. It's sort of like, you know, there's a whole powerful tradition. And part of the reason that you start with sutra is that you have to understand the basic idea of emptiness before you start imagining yourself as a Buddha.
Right.
Like if it's an ego trip, you're taking your chances for enlightenment and you're lighting them on fire and you're dropping them on the ground and you're just kind of watching them burn. Like
Mm-hmm.
without the understanding of what you're doing, you know, not only is it possible for people to go on all kinds of crazy ego trips, but like, I mean, people have accidental like Kundalini awakening experiences when they start working with their body's energy system in a way that's too intense for them. And there's just all sorts of stuff that can go wrong when you're working with your energy system and when you're trying to hold yourself and see everyone around you as a Buddha. Like I ran into this one woman in India at a retreat, and I asked her like, "Oh, what's your name?" And she gave like some kind of Buddhist name, the name of a Buddha. And I was like, "Where are you from?" And she was like, she gave the name of like a Pure Land. And I think she was not okay,
Uh-huh.
you know. So I think that's part of the reason, like in a Tibetan context, you use the sutra path to really get grounded, to understand like I can I can arise as a Buddha because I'm not actually this to begin with.
It's a thought comes from Alejandro Chaul and I, another fellow Rice person. When we were
Yeah.
talking, what seems like years ago, he was when you said it earlier about the sutras. My first comment or thought was that Buddhism has a lot of lists. There's a lot of lists and a lot of repetition. And
Yeah.
Ale and I talked about these, the 100,000 whatevers.
Yeah.
There are several 100,000 whatevers, and the way he said it, that even it still stands out today. He said, what his teacher told him is that in order to hold the milk, you need to have a bowl that is sufficient for the task, and that these kinds of repetitive practices are strengthening. And of course, we want to cut corners. I mean, Daniel LaRusso, right? He doesn't want to paint the fence, and he doesn't want to I use this shit all the time, by the way. I love the Karate Kid reference. So like he's like, come on, and Miyagi's like, oh, Daniel-san, you need to paint the fence. Like, I think it's so important to go through these practices
Mhm.
because we have that part of us that wants to jump in the deep end and, oh my god, if I don't know how to swim, then yes, I'm drowned. And
Yeah.
I really liked your story about that woman who kind of obviously identified with this kind of divinity, but didn't have the humility to put herself into right relationship with that kind of because reality, if anything, reality is much more overwhelming and wildly incomprehensible than I've ever imagined until recently. And like now I kind of have a slight grasp that I have no fucking clue what this is. And like to me that's like earth, like I've said that before, but now I kind of know that. It's like it is so far beyond what I ever imagined it. And like I need to have my feet on the ground and to be able to start to encounter that. So as we're kind of meandering in here, of course people want to jump into the esoteric back room and do the sexual practices, which we are going to talk about because I am going to quote somebody later. But this sutra stage, um, I started jujitsu recently, and one of the things I read is that 90% of people quit in their white belt.
Mm.
And of course it's the same kind of stuff. Like,
Mm.
God, I thought this was going to be about whatever, and I've got to learn how to like grab your collar 30 times in
Right.
like so thank you
Yeah.
for
Yeah. I think actually martial arts is a really good analogy for this. I spent, I think, 7 years studying Kung Fu from
nice
Sifu Steve Cottrell, Authentic Kung Fu in Fort Worth. And
nice
yeah, and it's the same thing. Like I studied Wing Chun, which is all about precision. You're
yeah
making precise angles and you're learning how to respond in very precise ways. And our my Sifu, our Kung Fu teacher, wouldn't let anyone go out to spar with anyone else for years. He said, "Look, you're going to train yourself when you start like sparring with somebody, you're going to train yourself in how to respond. And unless your body automatically responds with Wing Chun, you're going to learn how to fight with whatever comes out.
Yeah, like
And I think it's the
street
same
fight.
thing. Yeah, exactly. Like, I'm a white girl with no fighting experience. Like, what would have come out would have been crap, you know? And I think it's the same thing. Like, until something is automatic, you're not really able to, to use it in a functional way.
Right.
So like with meditation, if you're not really able to like have at least sort of a minimally stable mind, and then you go in and you try and work with your chakras, probably 99 people out of 100 will be fine, but like that one person might have real issues. And yeah, there's something about sort of the humility of recognizing, yes, like you kind of mentioned the foundational practices or Ngondro in Tibetan Buddhism, where there's, I think in our tradition there's 5 sets of things that you need to do 100,000 times. And if you're not willing to put in a few years and to do
Yeah.
that, then
Let's paint the fence,
like, yeah, exactly. Like you don't get to look cool in a match with your unpainted fence in the backyard.
Oh, yeah. Don't leave your fence unpainted.
Yeah.
Did you do all these practices?
Yeah.
Did you really?
Yeah. Are you kidding? Like I'm a type A rice student.
You're like, oh man, I took that on like crazy.
Yeah, like you tell me do these 500,000 things, I'm like, okay.
I got a number. Good.
Exactly.
Let's go.
I have an app. I'm still tracking. Yeah. I'm a little bit anal about this stuff.
There's technology for that these days.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, like that. How does that change you? Like, what have you noticed that those kinds of practices have have altered or expanded or whatever word you want to use?
Yeah. I feel like a broken record, but I kind of want to come back to this idea of purifying everything that is not Buddha nature. And, the tradition talks a lot about purification. And I think, like, in a modern context, I think I tend to hear that as like, now let's focus on everything you've ever done that is bad.
Mm.
And from a traditional context, it's much more about recognizing our own tendencies that are going to get in our way. You talked about Satan as being what is the obstacle in your path. Like those obstacles from this perspective are all internal.
Amen.
So it's like, it's,
Yes.
taking the time to do the repetitions. Like at some point you can't be thinking about where you're getting to, you have to be thinking about where you are, what you want to drop. I think a lot of times there's this idea of spiritual materialism, like what am I going to get out of doing these practices? And
Totally.
the foundational practices are the opposite. Like, what do I just not need to carry with me anymore? So I feel like for me, what I noticed was a real clearing out of, like a wearing smooth, like a buffing of a lot of rough edges that had been causing me and other people issues. But you notice them more, when you're in kind of an intensive practice environment. So a lot of buffing out and a lot of, I would say opening up too, really opening to something that's powerful and real and outside myself, which was something I really had shut down towards, I think, after, my breakup with Christianity. But the idea that you can't do Tibetan Buddhism really, I think, without having a sense of openness to the flow of blessings, the openness to the lineage, that you're not doing it by yourself. I think that's what really cracked open for me in the process of doing these foundational practices. I
So
still do them. I do them every morning. I mean, I don't ever want to stop doing them.
it's like brushing your teeth.
Yeah, exactly.
Some people don't even do that.
Yeah. It's like, well, I
You're
mastered
doing you're
showering,
doing
so I'm good.
100,000 like prostrations and like
Yeah. Yeah.
motherfucker, brush your teeth. Look at what
Right.
Claire's doing. She's
Right.
bowing 6,000 times every day.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
not that hard.
so yeah, that's my meditation. Is my toothbrush. My wife would like my dental floss to be my meditation, but unfortunately, it happens every third day or whatever. Uh, So okay, tantric. Now I feel kind of like you said there were three things, and you went. Did you get all three? A
No.
sutra. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about Tantra, and just to kind of connect the idea of the foundational practices with the idea of Tantra. Um, in the foundational practices, you're really opening yourself up to a flow of blessings. You know, you're practicing arising as certain types of Buddhas. You're practicing calling on, you know, the lineage, calling on external forces, and those are all the things you're going to do in Tantra. um you know we can talk more about tantric practice and what it is in a moment, but so there's sutra, there's tantra, and then for us there's also Dzogchen, which is the great perfection. it's kind of like it's kind of like you've spent all this time learning jazz and like internalizing the scales so that you can play them in your sleep. Like you just have the muscle memory to do all these things, and then you let go. So like if jazz and improvisation is kind of the letting go, like that's what Dzogchen is in this school of Tibetan Buddhism. And there are other comparable practices kind of at the highest level, so to speak, of different Tibetan schools. But with Dzogchen, you've learned and done so much practice, and now you're learning to actually just stop. Just stop creating a view of yourself as ordinary, stop creating a view of yourself as a deity, and just relax into what is. And it sounds very simple, but it's an incredibly profound set of
Oh my God, it
practices.
sounds like bliss, is what it sounds like. I mean, if you use a music metaphor, I'm already, you know, I get that. Like I'm not a jazz musician, but I certainly understand that that sense, you know, of being on stage and performing music, and you know, allowing the kind of emotional experience and being very present. You know, you're not thinking about what you're saying or how you're moving, or you're just moving. That's very beautiful. I didn't know that actually about Dzogchen. I've heard a number of lectures on it, but to contextualize in this way, that really helps. Thank you. That I like that a lot.
You're most welcome. I mean, I think Dzogchen, sort of like Tantra, is one of these things that people, they often feel like they're going through the lower practices so they can get to these. So like a lot of people want to start with Dzogchen, and I think you're just doing something very different if you start there.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way to skip the years that it takes. Again, to come back to that music analogy, like if you don't know the scales, if your body doesn't intimately know that instrument, the idea that you're going to just do something spontaneously and it'll sound remotely like music is, I think, overly optimistic.
Oh,
But there are
great.
some people, because of their karmic inclinations or whatever, it might work for them, but that's not traditionally the way it was done.
Karmic. You
I
think
think,
you say karmic? No, go on. Sorry.
sorry, I just want to like put a PS on that. Like, I think the language, and I think something similar is maybe the case in Zen, like the language of radical simplicity means something very different if you contextualize it as coming after you've memorized all this stuff and you've done the hundreds and thousands or millions of repetitions of other things, and then you let go. Like, that's different from me sitting down as a 20-year-old and being like, I'm gonna just let go and see what happens. Like, it would have been a bunch of like sex fantasies and food fantasies and like
Totally.
not, we're not arriving at the nature of reality.
Right. Yeah, you're like going down the pathways of mind, and like undressing some kind of mythic other,
Yeah.
because I want this to be our entry. I want this to be our entry. Aha! Here it is. So, so here's something. Like I had an interview with a fellow. I have 14 pairs of glasses. Um, I did an interview with a fella who blew my mind, and is highly controversial, and knows it. He's very well aware of it. But he studies ancient medical texts.
Mm.
So Greek, Latin texts that have not been translated, because they need to be translated by somebody who understands medical language. So
Mm-hmm.
he's one of a very few people that can do this.
Mm-hmm.
So he reads the kind of Christian Bible in certainly the New Testament in Greek, and suggests some very interesting practices of communion. Now, this is
Mm.
not that thread that looks at communion that a guy named Carl Ruck, he would say that communion or the Eucharist was a psychedelic ritual and highly influenced by the mushroom. And, in fact, there were moments where Jesus and his band of, disciples were basically just tripping in the nature and like having radical experiences, and yeah, you would. But what he talks about is the Eucharist involving sexual activity, but importantly, sexual fluids, and the body and the blood were in several traditions, these kind of early Gnostic, very esoteric, of course, very sexual traditions involved taking bodily fluids as part of the Eucharist, the body and the blood. So this is a quote from Samuel, Civilized Shamans.
Oh yeah,
Oh wait, no, not that
Jeffrey
one.
Samuel.
Hang on, this is I misquoted. This is, where did you? Davidson, Esoteric Buddhism. That's this one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Through the union of wisdom. Wait, no, let me start with you. Actually, this is you. In such a ritual, the male initiate would bring a female sexual partner with him to the consecration, in the process of which the Vajra master would perform a ritual to transform himself into the deity, and then practice ritual sexual union with the female partner. The initiate would then ingest some of the couple's mingled sexual fluids, the ejaculate of the master having been transfigured into the seed of the deity. The initiate himself would then couple with his female partner, thus assuming the identity of the deity. Here is the reading Snellgrove offers in his ritual, Snellgrove. And then it goes on, of course, just to reiterate what you've just said before. So that's closer to a lot of formulation of what tantric sexuality is. But even still, people that are practicing Tantra, I'm imagining, are not going into the back of the room behind the room and embodying a deity and taking the semen of their master on their tongue, and then union with the female consort who's also a deity. Like, that ain't happening. I'm assuming, of course, someplace somewhere that is happening.
I'm sure.
But like, talk about that for a second, and let's kind of unpack that from like where we've misunderstood that, and also where those practices are placed in this lineage of tantric Buddhism.
Yeah, so I think this is, what might be termed like left-handed tantra.
Yeah.
Like there's always been an aspect of tantra, and I should just say also, tantra, I haven't done much reading in the past probably 7 years about like the origins of tantra, so scholarship may have moved on from where I was when I wrote that paper. But at that time, there's a pretty strong theory that, Buddhist Tantra, definitely Buddhist Tantra, and what we would now call Hindu forms of Tantra, they seem to have originated very much in dialogue, possibly, among communities in close contact, maybe in the region of Kashmir, sort of like northwestern Indian cultural region. So there's a lot of contact between, Buddhist Tantra and non-Buddhist Tantra, for lack of a better term. And, it sounds like at some point, those kinds of actual enactments may have happened. Something that's, I think, unique and interesting about Tibetan history, though, and this has to do with the fact that the spiritual authority and the political authority were so like deeply intertwined. Like most places that Tantra spread to, the rulers were not into Tantra. So it kind of had to stay underground. Tibet, as far as I'm aware, is the one like larger society where Tantra went above ground. And it's partly because of what I write about in that paper, this process of taking something that's esoteric and it's, mysterious and powerful, but everybody wants it. So how do you make it available to more people? Inevitably you come up with adaptations, people offering it, to wider and wider circles. Um, but I think a lot of that kind of left-handedness got worked out of mainstream tantra in Tibet because you have these monasteries and monks, you have, institutional support for them. You just can't have people acting crazy and doing a bunch of sex orgies while they're drunk and like, going out making animal sacrifice. Like, you just can't have that stuff happening and still get like royal support. They're going to be like, no, I'm sorry. Y'all have gone too far. Like the real yogis and like these, folks just operating outside this world of good and bad, they don't make good partners for the government. so so like with Tibet, definitely by the times I was looking into in my dissertation, you really, I'm not aware that that stuff was happening. I'm not aware that it's happening. I'm sure someone's doing it nowadays.
They're
I've
definitely doing
never
it these
heard of
days.
it. Pardon?
They're definitely doing it these days. Somebody somewhere is doing that these days. Definitely.
Yeah, exactly. I don't get invited.
Right. I'm not invited to
But
that party.
yeah, I'm not cool enough. Yeah, but I think part of why this kind of left-handed tantra is powerful and part of the reason it developed was to break through people's taboos. Like if you think about Hindu culture, if you think about what it means to be a high status Hindu person, a Brahmin who has all these restrictions on you're not allowed to touch this and you're not allowed to eat that. If you think about this left-handed tantra in that way, with people doing forbidden things, doing polluting things,
Mm-hmm.
it's about cracking open that sense of I am
Total
righteous.
trickster. Yeah.
Pardon?
Total trickster.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and I think that strand is very central to Buddhism. Like there's acting in moral ways so you don't cause yourself and others harm, but at the end of the day you have to let go of the duality of good and evil. And and crack open to what is, because it's not dualistic. you know it's not something that fits neatly into any box. There's no conceptual category for reality itself. So those, I think that sort of so-called left-handed tantra, or these like transgressive forms of tantra, the intention, one of the intentions is to crack open that idea that like I'm a good person, I don't do that. Boom, I just ate meat. I just drank alcohol. Those things aren't shocking to us anymore. They don't function in the same way. They're not transgressive. So I think that's the reason that a lot of the sort of like underpinning, the sacred underpinnings of tantric ritual back in the day, they don't really work for us. Like part of a tantric, it's called a tsok, like an offering, a gathering where you offer, food and drink and whatnot to the deities that you've invited, and you share it with your fellow practitioners. There's a rule that you're supposed to have at least some small bit of meat and some kind of alcohol. And in the day, in the context of a Brahmin lifestyle, that would have been totally like, to do that, you have to step beyond good and bad. For us, it's normal. So it's not transgressive, you
Well,
know?
well, but I thought of something that's so benign yet so powerful. If I challenge anybody watching or listening to, this is like in the time of COVID and the pandemic, but I challenge anybody who is on an elevator regularly to get into the elevator and to face the opposite direction of the doors, and don't do anything. I
Yeah.
want you to observe your anxiety. I want you to observe other people's anxiety. And I think that's the potency of transgression.
Yeah.
Of course, this really makes it like, of course, if you have this like dogma that turns into rigidity, that turns into the moral question about what is good and what is not, and then everything else is kicked out of the tradition, you're going to have a societal compensation that says, hang on, let's right this ship, because your entire ethic is actually one-sided,
Right.
and you're literally trying to transcend dualism. And so but it again, I think what's so cool about this is that when you see it from a kind of unified whole, there's no need for othering. It's just
Yeah.
complementarying, and you're fixed together, because this, or I guess this one is created in direct relationship to this one. And that to me is kind of a radical idea and concept. I tend to like this side of things.
The left side.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not like, I would say I've got a bit of a transgressor in me. I'm not trying to like be amoral, but I certainly like to poke at certain conventional norms socially, and on some level, I guess, to keep myself guessing, and that is probably frustrating to some people, but it like I just always want to be moving,
Hmm.
moving
Hmm.
around, and I know that I'm emotive in that way, and so but I really just like, I certainly am attracted to that. Not as if I want to be in the Gnostic orgy where there's doing like all the crazy shit, like, but I definitely want to know the esoteric traditions, and I want to have a choice
Yeah.
to experience or know and read that kind of material that I just read and have it totally make sense.
Yeah.
Because when I first heard of all that, it was like, whoa, like, of course it happens, but I had no, like, from a Christian, Western, really
Right.
Judeo-Christian perspective that's so steeped in morality and like
Right.
solar consciousness, it's like those kinds of dark underworld journeys are not, that's I mean, that's evil, right? Like, back to your
Right.
kind of original sin, like that. We don't do that.
Right, right. Like it's a strongly dualistic system.
Yes.
There's good and there's evil. And if you cross over to the other side, then you're evil.
Yes.
And you're not supposed to do that.
Right. That's
Instead
bad.
of it's a whole.
Yeah, you're bad for doing that. We're gonna kick you out of the tribe. So
Yeah.
I'm looking time. I want to be mindful for us to have enough runway to close out. So just first, what threads are we leaving out, or is there anything that you have that you really need to say to kind of complete this conversation we're having today?
Well, yeah, I think I'd like to just finish up with addressing Tantra and some of the other, like the transformative impact of what you're talking about. Um, you know, Tantra, even the kind of like sexual Tantra that people think of, maybe it's working with your energy system.
Hmm.
And I think this is another huge gap in our sort of Western understanding of ourselves as beings. Like, even with mind body medicine, it's still not mind body spirit or mind
Right.
body energy, and part of what's powerful about Tantra is that you're going directly into the energy of lust or the energy of fear or the energy of hatred. You're going directly into them. It's like a different version of analyzing to see, where's my body, is it truly existent. You feel that energy within yourself, and you practice letting the storyline drop and feeling, not just the energy of, say, hatred, but when you take out, when you stop adding, I guess I should say, this person is bad, they're evil, I need to like destroy them, whatever it is. When you stop adding that, it's just energy. And that energy itself can be used to transform your mind or to propel the spiritual journey. And that's why there's such a proliferation of different images of different types of Buddhas in tantric practice, because you're harnessing different types of energies. And like you're saying, like you look at a wrathful Buddha, and they have like flames for hair, and they're carrying a skull cup and a knife, and like it's a terrifying iconography. But if you understand, like, what's being destroyed is what I can't let go of, it's my attachment to a small sense of self. Then you're using the energy of that figure to get free. Whereas
Hmm.
usually that type of energy, hatred just makes you more stuck. Understanding, being able to use like the pure, the natural form of that energy, it's not hatred anymore, it's something else. Maybe it's discriminating wisdom, maybe it's the ability to cut through what's holding us back from really becoming the Buddhas that we are. So I just wanted to add that piece of Tantra, is that, you're really actually working with energies themselves. We could call them even emotions themselves. And instead of trying to prevent them from arising or not trying to feed them, you're just looking directly into them. And it can be a very powerful form of practice.
I like what you just said, because the thought for me was how often repression is the approach,
Right.
and how you know don't hate.
Right.
Like, what? Like, I'm now I'm massively in conflict. Like, now I'm
Yeah.
a bad person because I have hate, or
Yeah.
I hate something. No, I'm a freaking person. I'm natural. It's like that. Like, I think that you just summarized to me one of the most oppressive aspects of culture,
Mhm.
which is even in our emotional systems, when we like separate out.
Mhm.
um, I was connected with this couples therapist at one point, and she had said, my husband taught me how to hate. And I really appreciated that, because
Mm.
it was such an important reminder around not to like evacuate from or
Mhm.
disconnect from, or even worse, really repress and
Mhm.
judge, but to express, to get curious to what
Mhm.
is your hatred? How can I talk about that?
Mhm.
And I appreciate any practice that has that fundamentally. It's kind of an amoral, from our traditionally understood morality. It's kind of an amoral tradition, because you're not saying, this one is good. You can love, but don't hate.
Right, right, right.
I like the fire, like skull cap, like Kali kind of like figure. Like, I want, where is that person in me, and like, how does that show up?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is maybe a place to make a distinction between how the Buddhist tradition presents itself and like maybe what Jeff Kripal would say about, well, I mean, lots of people would say about the amoral aspect of like mystical experience or these kind of like peak experiences. The Buddhist tradition definitely sees these as expressions of enlightened beings. So like if you're enlightened, then whatever you're doing, whatever it looks like, is for the benefit of whoever's around you. I mean, the problem is we don't know who's enlightened.
Yeah.
Or when you start thinking that you are enlightened and whatever you do is, whatever is beneficial, you've transcended good and evil. So, there's definitely like an understanding still that these types of energies have a place within an ethical framework.
Hmm.
You feel the hatred, you're not acting out of it, you're like sitting within and experiencing it, and transforming it. So, I think there's still um, there's a lot of gray area when it comes to tantra and ethics, and that, obviously we've seen people fall on their faces in many many ways. But like the idea of the tradition is that it's still unfolding within sort of like the enlightened intention of a Buddha, or at least the aspiration toward that.
And then the practices that support that process. To me, it's like, again, I love this thing that my friend Brian told me about Graham Hancock, where he said human beings are exceptional amnesiacs. And
Yeah.
to me, that's what practice is. Like, a ritual practice is like recognizing your amnesic nature and repeating to remind and remember that this is your experience.
Yeah, I love it. It's a great way of summing up tantric practice, I think.
Okay, well, that's good. Okay, so what? Let's close out. What else? How do we want to close out? What do you think is important? Any slender threads that are left hanging?
I mean, I guess for me, like the kind of, I just want to like reflect on the continuity of this theme of Buddha nature and of other emptiness, of, all these different techniques, but at the end of the day, they're about clearing out, everything we've kind of accumulated on top of who we really are. Um, I think, something similar can be said for shamanic practices,
Hmm.
that there's a sort of remembering, like a putting back together of the elements within ourselves, our connection with the world around us, our connection with powerful beings that are not physical. um yeah, or you mentioned psychedelics. I think they offer one of these, like a modality to crack open this like container that we feel is so real. Just crack it open, and for a moment you look around, and everybody talks about the importance of integrating those experiences into daily life, which is
Right.
practice basically. So I think these are different, they're different ways in maybe, but I feel that there's something really powerful at the heart of all of them.
Well, and that I do think is the issue with psychedelics as a like party
Mm.
experience, is that there doesn't tend to be as much, and this is, I'm at risk of being moral here. I'm moralistic. I'm like, oh,
Right.
you know. But I think one. I mean, look, going to a rave on ecstasy, I'm sure, is exactly what it is. Ecstasy. Like, I bet it's just freaking marvelous, you know. But it's incomplete. I would imagine it's incomplete, or it could be. It's probably got more of a tendency to be incomplete than having something where you're a little more conscious, closed-eyed, or connected with somebody else with MDMA. So that it's back to that like set and setting thing. And what I've learned from a number of people who are studying this, it's about preparation.
Mhm.
So preparation, have the event, integration, and then how do you contribute to your daily living because of this experience? And I just don't know if many people, certainly in their 20s, where I was, are exploring with these kinds of substances and integrating it into their daily life. Because I know for me back then, it was like, whoa, that was a really good time. That was amazing, but it was incomplete. And so
Yeah.
I think that kind of language can keep us from falling into the moral split, like just recognizing that it's not a full experience, not that it's bad, not that it shouldn't be done. There are certain issues with responsibility and harm to self and the environment, of course, but to have a practice supporting those kinds of glimpses into reality is, I think, will bring out a fuller experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, whether the glimpse is coming from meditation or, you're walking in nature and just something cracks open, or psychedelics, like, I think they're powerful. I think any of those glimpses, whatever their cause, can set people on a different path. A lot of
Totally,
folks ended up on spiritual paths because they had that glimpse and they were like, I have to learn more.
totally.
So yeah, I don't think it's like a, thou shalt not kind of thing. But like, what do you want from it?
Yeah,
Do you want the one time, or do you want to transform your life?
I mean, I want to transform my life, right? Like that. Even when I was younger, though, it was like I didn't have the container, so
Yeah.
my container was like rock and roll and staying up really late and like writing songs at 4 a.m. with your 10 friends, like that was,
Yeah.
but that was a religious event, I mean,
Yeah.
okay, we got to finish. I love talking to you. This is really fun. And
Likewise.
I can tell you, this has been a fantastic education into some territory that I have studied before and certainly known peripherally, but I really appreciate the insight that you've brought to the conversation today, Claire.
Oh, my pleasure. I would have liked to have read that article beforehand, but it's been super fun to kind of tie together. These are different things that I'm really interested in. Obviously Dharma practice, and that's like a whole, huge
Yes,
umbrella, but also, these other ways of exploring mind and exploring and connecting with nature. And so it's been great to connect with you. I feel
me
like we
too.
already kind of knew each other.
I
Like,
know.
we know so many of the same people. So I
Yes,
really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
you too. Where do you want to send people?
I should have thought of that. Probably clairevillarreal.com is the best place. I'll send you a link to that, and
Look
some other
below, and I'll
stuff.
have a link. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And
Yeah,
if
if
you
any.
have anything else, just send it over, and I'll include it in the liner notes.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
What a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
likewise. Like,
Okay.
I appreciate your questions and your context that you said.
New love unfold. control.